by asking the audience to speak. Just let's talk about what does Machiavellian mean to you? What do you think of when you hear that term? Conniving. Conniving.
I think of more strategic,
Okay. Conniving, strategic, manipulative. Ruthless. What's ruth? What are you less? What have you got less of if you're ruthless? It's forgiveness, solidarity, empathy, compassion, I think. Means that Ruth is a lovely name. But mainly, we only think of it... It's funny that we don't have the word Ruth very much in the English language, but ruthless, we have got. There are lots of English words like that. We're just talking about etymology and grammar. Yeah, ruthless, conniving, strategic, manipulative. Anything else? Realistic. Absolutely. Yeah. Cynical. Ambitious. I think all of these, right, I wish I was able to write it up. I won't write on the wall, but you've got that. Some of you write it down in your books, could you actually? Because that, I think, absolutely is a Machiavelli vocabulary. Ruthlessness, ambition, cynicism, manipulativeness, connivingness, etc. Let's keep that in front of us, and we might come back to that, in fact. I think it's very likely that we will. There are loads of Machiavellis in popular culture, both contemporary and past. Anybody got a Machiavelli in their mind, a figure, perhaps from fiction, perhaps from real life? Yeah. Malcolm Tucker, yeah, absolutely. Okay, who wrote that? Oh, so it's not a quiz. Sorry, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Anybody Google it. If you can come up with the new Machiavelli on Google, you can share it with us when we get it. Thank you. Malcolm Tucker, do the younger generation in the room know who we're talking about? No, you won't. Of course you won't, because we're all different ages. The thick of it is a BBC TV programme, and the current Doctor Who, Malcolm Capaldi, plays the chief of staff to, as it were, the new Blair government, based, I think, on a real person, Alistair Campbell, or a particular view that some of us have of Alistair Campbell. The House of Cards is an older one. So what decade is the House of Cards? 1980s?
You're showing your detachment from pop culture. There's a new House of Cards.
There's a new House of Cards. Okay, what I'm expecting is that people are going to be Googling this stuff now, and then when we pause, you can share it with us. Okay, so here's a picture then. We've got Machiavellianism, which I hope people have written down, all those words, all those adjectives, and we've got Machiavellians. So we've got Malcolm Tucker, Francis Urquhart from the House of Cards, and I'm going to be talking about another one, which is Iago from Shakespeare's Othello. Okay, so absolutely right. I mean, 100% on the Machiavellianism quiz, because that is exactly what you would find if you Googled it and looked at Wikipedia, or even if you looked in the Oxford English Dictionary. And obviously, as the blurb for this session has indicated, I'm going to be saying that that's not all there is to Machiavelli, and that there's another side of it, and it's all much more complicated than that. But I think we could start by tracing historically that association of Niccolo Machiavelli, who, by everybody who knew him, was just agreed to be a really nice, funny, sensitive guy. And I'm going to be coming back to the nice, funny, sensitive aspects of Machiavelli a lot in what I say. But in the period in which he was writing, and certainly in which his works were published and translated in 1521 or in the early 16th century, that association of Machiavelli with all of those traits owed a good deal to a generalised appreciation of Italians. Italians in general were thought of as vicious, cowardly, false, untrustworthy, dissimulating. If Italians were going to kill you, they wouldn't do it in an open kind of courageous way. They'd poison you, right? They were associated with being sneaky. It was an absolutely ubiquitous set of associations in early modern France, Scotland, and England. And Machiavelli's name very quickly, once his works were translated into French and into English, becomes associated with that range of evils, such as duplicity, the cynical uses of religion. Ruthlessness is a term that's always associated with him. Now, there was one book above all which was responsible for that meaning of Machiavellianism. It was written by a Huguenot, Innocent Gentillet. He was from Geneva, and he wrote a book which was in 1576, or it was published anonymously in 1576, which popularly became known as the Anti-Machiavel. In French, it was the discourse on the difficulties of relationships between the French and Swiss republics, the French state, the Swiss republics, and other states. And it was all about the religion, council, policing, and it was about the themes from Machiavelli, contra Niccolo Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, the Florentine, he called it. It was published anonymously in 1576. It was translated into English in 1602. Very likely that Shakespeare had read it. It was popular. There were certainly, if you look at books about what Shakespeare might have read, the Anti-Machiavel is certainly on the list. It came into English in 1602. He wrote Othello in 1604. It all sorts of fits. Now, Gentillet assumes that Machiavelli's doctrine was the inspiration for court strategies and politics in France, which was popularly believed to have been infiltrated by Italians and Italian ways. And Italian ways were corrupting what should be French ways. And how he did this was to render the content of The Prince, which is a short book. And short books are good. I'm really for short books, but there's no doubt that the shortness of this book has got something to do with the way it's been read. He rendered The Prince into a series of maxims. Now, Jake was saying to me that having reread it, it's very, very easy to render it as a series of quotable quotes. And of course, we like quotable quotes in our culture, and early moderns like quotable quotes in their culture as well. And you can do that. So you can just quote bits of it. It's better to be feared than loved. You know, if you're going to have someone killed, do it in the most ruthless, exemplary fashion you can, and so on. You know, never follow the laws of God, and he did this. So he wrote it out as a series of maxims, emphasising ruthlessness, there's that word again, mendacity, lying, godlessness. Machiavelli is loathed and feared because he is understood as an atheist, cruelty. And the Machiavel then very quickly appears, I mean, even prior to the translation of the Contra Machiavel, it quickly appears in English drama, notably in Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta. But the theme of Machiavellian politics, Machiavellian uses of violence as being against military valour, honesty, heroism, all these great upstanding virtues, love, good rule, runs through Shakespeare's plot lines. And Shakespeare is evidently doing nothing more than what Shakespeare often did, of course, which is just recycle very commonplace, commonplace stereotypes. Shakespeare's plays are full of them. and he takes advantage of common sense, and often not very nice common sense, in order to draw his audiences in. He's also a genius who does with common sense stuff morally and politically that no other dramatist had ever done before. He uses language in a completely different way. So saying that he recycles commonplace stereotypes isn't in any sense, I don't think, to take away Shakespeare's value. Now, as I said, biographers of Machiavelli write about somebody quite different. They emphasise how nice he was, how funny he was, how sensitive, how clever in a good way. He was technically astute. He was interested in mathematics. He was immersed in the classics. Jean Thiers, the author of the Anti-Machiavel, wasn't bothered about what Machiavelli was really like, and in fact he says in his preface of his life and death, "I say nothing. Neither did I, or would I say it, or vouchsafed I once to inquire thereof, because his memory deserves better to be buried in perpetual oblivion than to be renewed among men. I may well say that if his life were like his doctrine, as is to be presumed, there was never a man in the world more contaminated, more defiled with vices and wickedness than he was." So he's prepared to admit that he knows nothing about him, he's prepared to infer from his reading of the Prince to what Machiavelli must have been, and to think that he was the epitome of wickedness. And in fact, we have a term for the devil in English, which goes back to the Elizabethan period, which is Old Nick, and Nick is Niccolo Machiavelli. He becomes one and the same with the devil for the Shakespearean period. Okay, who he was really, he was born in 1569 in Florence, when Florence was dominated by the Medici family, who were a kind of oligarchy, who ran the place as governors, also as landlords and exploiters of the city's wealth. They were able to sort of sell rights to open shops and all that kind of thing. There was obviously a history of conspiracy against the Medici, because families like that will be invested in by some members of a society and opposed by others. And Machiavelli's family was associated with participating in republican rule in the periods when the Medici were out of power. In 1494, Charles VIII of France invaded Italy and Florence, and the Medici were overthrown, and we saw the rise of a highly puritanical religious government headed by a monk called Savonarola, who was preaching the sort of purity that is very, very familiar to us today. And Machiavelli was out of government at the time of Savonarola. Savonarola, of course, fell, because people who live by violence will often, not invariably, fall in violence, and he ended up being executed. And at that point, a republican government took over in Florence again, and Machiavelli served as the secretary of the 10 of Liberty and Peace. That Florence did its government by numbers, a bit like we talk about the 26 or the group of 8, or, you know, we have that as well. But this is individuals. The 10 of Liberty and Peace would be a council of 10 individuals, and he was their secretary. Later, he was the secretary of the 8 of Affairs, when the Medici came back into power after his rehabilitation. But when the Medici did come back into power, Machiavelli was suspected of having been part of a plot against their return, and he was arrested by them, imprisoned, and in fact he was tortured, as was, I guess, common for people who were arrested in those days as it is now. Now, having been released from prison, he was suspected of having been part of a plot. I don't know whether he was or he wasn't. I mean, I'm not enough of a historian. I'm sure historians have views. But he was sentenced to a kind of internal exile. So he was banished from public life, and he began to write. During that time, between 1512, when he was released from prison, he composed The Prince. He composed the Discourses, which are discourses on Titus Livy. And the relationship between these two books is absolutely central to my thesis. He was writing them more or less at the same time. The research for one is the research for the other. They're different books, but they have a very, very close relationship. He also wrote The Ass. He wrote La Mandragola, which is a lasting play, which is very, very famous. He wrote a brilliant book called The Art of War, and he wrote the Florentine Histories. Then in 1525, he got back into a job, and he was appointed Chancellor of the 5 administrators of the city walls, picking up his old expertise on security and defence, and he died in 1527, just as Rome was sacked by German invaders, and Charles V of Spain was crowned King of Italy, a Medici Pope. So he lived during incredibly turbulent times, right? Governments coming in and going out. He himself got jobs and then he lost jobs. He was tortured in prison. And he was a sublime poet, among other things. Okay, The Prince. How do we read this? As I said, it's often read as a series of maxims, not only by Gentillet, Jake sort of read it as a series of maxims. You can be forgiven for reading it that way. Use religion as a political tool, he says. Impoverish, oppress and terrorise subjects, then deliver them from terrorism and you will look brilliant, he says. So make things really bad and then come in and make the situation really good. Provoke discord among subjects to keep them under control. Kill when necessary, etc. Now, it's hard for us audiences to really get to grips with either of the books because they're both based in examples which he takes from Roman history, ancient Roman history. Sometimes from more recent Italian and Western European history. And his method is to take a story which he assumes his audience will be familiar with, but of course the problem is that we're not so familiar with them, and then use that as a starting point for reflection and meditation sometimes, and thinking, what does this say to us about the stability of states or city life, or what it is to be a prince, or indeed what it is to be a citizen. And the result then is elliptical, because obviously much of the analysis consists of, well, on the one hand, we could read it like this, and on the other hand, we could read it like that. And there's this kind of something of an inconclusiveness in the lessons that he draws, although he often is prepared to say, well, look, you had better be understood by the people you're speaking to, and you had better be willing to conciliate, otherwise you're going to meet a nasty end. So he does come across with those kind of quite dogmatic lessons. So it's quite a moralistic, the moral of the tale is thus and so. But the telling of the tale has always set up lots of problems and questions. Now, in the 20th century, many, many thinkers, political theorists like Isaiah Berlin and people like that, have taken it that Machiavelli is really modern in the way that Shakespeare is really modern. And he's often cited as the original political scientist, that what we get from the two books are the principles that underlie what we would now think of as authoritarian systems, the principles that you live by if you want to be like Putin, let's say, against the principles that underlie what he called republican systems, which we can see as being discernibly having sort of democratic traits in them, the principles that you have to put into, you have to live by and work by if you're, say, Obama, right? Two different systems, different cultures, different political cultures, different sets of institutions, different traditions of relationships, and this is how you do it. So it can be read as comparative political science for the very first time. Very interesting, I think, in terms of Shakespeare, who also can be read as a comparativist in that way. That Shakespeare gives us on the one hand and on the other hand, but we won't go into Shakespeare too much. So it's prescriptive. Both of the books are prescriptive. This prescribes how you'd better behave if you want to be like Putin, and this prescribes how you'd better behave if you want to be Obama. It's a bit simplistic, right? How to run a republic. Now, there's another view, which is that rather than being prescriptive, a sort of recipe for rule, the Prince is a warning to us Republicans. Us people who believe in human life, who believe in ordinary people, and who believe that, you know, life in cities and in the countryside has got to be okay for us, we read the Prince as telling us what will happen if we let someone get above themselves, so that they come to be a sole ruler, or indeed an oligarchical ruler, you know, an authoritarian, top-down power. This is how you can expect the authoritarians to behave. Don't let it happen. And that really is a pretty plausible reading, I think. And there's another thesis which has been articulated by the American political theorist Mary Dietz, who wrote her thesis on the Prince and said that she thought that the Prince was designed actually more explicitly than that to trap the Medici into behaving in a bloodthirsty, you know, ruthless kind of way, and then that would lead to their downfall again. So she sees it as kind of Machiavellian to the nth degree, right? More Machiavellian even than Machiavelli. Okay, I can't really judge between those three. I think Mary Dietz is, for all I know, it will turn out to be right historically, and we'll come up with some letters that prove that, you know, that was exactly what he intended. Who knows? It's a reading by her. My feeling, and when I teach Machiavelli to graduates and undergraduates, is that you've got to read the two books together. That just as we take it that Shakespeare is the author both of Macbeth and of Much Ado About Nothing, and the Two Gentlemen of Verona, you know, we need to look, and the poems, we need to sort of take them in relation to each other. He was writing them together, as I say. And actually, part 3 of the discourses has a long disquisition on the dilemmas of being a prince. So it doesn't repeat the content of the Prince, but it sort of is another interpretation of it. Okay, now, on using that and taking Machiavelli all in all and taking the context, this is what I think we take from Machiavelli, and it's going to generate for us a different political vocabulary, which I also hope that when we get to it, some of you will write down for us. The need to avoid contempt and hatred is the Prince chapter 19. Do not be rapacious or cruel. Bloodthirsty, brutal forms of violence. Well, A, they're bloodthirsty and brutal, so they're kind of wicked. They're also a bad look in being sort of a bit shallow about it, but they will only generate more bloodthirsty violence. That kind of violence just gets out of hand. You cannot rule like that. It's inhuman. Corruption breeds corruption. You can't be corrupt and get away with it. There's no such thing, as it were, as a single act of corruption or a single act of brutality, because they have effects that ripple on, and it will come back to you in the form of corruption and brutality. And the task is to maintain institutions which conciliate the people. And I'm going to come back to conciliate, and if anybody wants to Google conciliate, feel free to do so. Chapter 21, how a prince must act to win honour, is to govern capably, to see the truth in friendship. Friendship's another key political value in our world, to esteem talent. And here's what I think is really important, to know the society. As well as being the first political scientist, he's often understood to be the first social scientist, because Machiavelli knows that societies aren't just society. They're differentiated into groups, into religious groups, cultural groups, subcultures, classes, in some societies, caste groups. You're not dealing just with a Florentine. You are dealing with a Florentine whose father was an artisan and who's a member of that church and lives in this neighbourhood. You've got to know, as it were, the texture of your society. In the discourses, he discusses administrative methods, and he discusses the differences between being very severe and being a fellowship type of administrator. And he thinks that if you're going to govern in a democracy or a republic, you have to be humane rather than arrogant, compassionate rather than cruel. You have to display and act humanity and kindness, continence, generosity. All of these words are in quotable quotes. They just don't make their way into Google. It really is very, very extraordinary. And he emphasises free speech. The thing about the city-states of Italy, but also other cities like London and Oxford, is that you've got loads of people chatting on, passing comment, talking to each other. And if you get, if you're the kind of person who gets paranoid about other people talking, the only means open to you are the authoritarian ones. They're locking people up for what they say, they're policing speech and so on. And Machiavelli understands city life and thinks that city life is brill. I don't think he's, as it were, contemptuous of the countryside, but he thinks that the future is in cities. And in cities, you're going to have taverns and theatres and open spaces, and people will talk. And talking people are the citizens. They're the people who are participating in the life and the governance of the city. And he also believes in popular appointment to office, which is, people have just got to be prepared to step up and be the secretary to the five of the walls, or if the five of the walls have really got a problem because the walls aren't very well designed and are all falling down, everybody had better start participating in the work of the five of the walls and get those walls built back up again. Otherwise, we're not going to have the city that the walls are there to defend. Okay, so his central political value, in my understanding, is conciliation. Right, who's Googled conciliation, please? Conciliate. What does it mean? What does it remind you of? Anything? Sorry? Ah, okay. Does anybody agree? Appeasement, yeah, which has a bad name in the 20th century, right? That has very bad connotations for us. But, yeah, okay. Yeah. Ironing out differences, yeah. Getting over conflict. Mediating. Settlement. Negotiated settlement. Yeah, that's right. Our terms council, CIL, come from the activity of conciliation. That's what town councils do, or councils in any other institution. Anybody got anything else insightful? She's doing her email. No, you're not. Okay, okay, it's fine. It's all right. It's not. It's not. Okay, now, in what way is conciliation the central value? Well, it has been certainly since the Romans. It's also there in Aristotle, and it surfaces from time to time in political theory. That the point of politics and political power is that people do disagree. They have diverse interests. They don't all get along harmoniously. We're not, as it were, a community in that sense of everybody sharing the same stuff or the same beliefs, or we're not all marching in step. And we can have discord and hostility, or we can have action in concert, which is not at all marching in the same in step with each other. Neither is it being shoulder to shoulder. Being shoulder to shoulder has its place. You'd better do that if you're in the midst of a military battle. And of course, in modern times, we associate the being shoulder to shoulder and the value of solidarity and the practice of solidarity with the feminist movement, the suffrage movement, the unions, and so on, shoulder to shoulder, definitely part of our political culture. But there's this other one, which is actually listening to the people who you don't agree with, understanding who they are, but also understanding and accepting that they are. Because if you're in denial about them, or if your objective is to eliminate them, then we're not even in the realm of politics, political power, or any other of those kinds of words. We're in the realm of something else: physical power, punishment, whatever, banishment. So conciliation is about acknowledgement first, recognition, a degree of reciprocity, and I think that's right, it's about settlement. But of course, no settlement is forever, because we will settle that we're going to have a law about free speech or a law against free speech or something, but we won't have settled it for very long, because as soon as we've settled it, given that we're committed to free speech, people are going to start speaking up against whatever it was that we've agreed. So there's this very fragile aspect of Machiavellian politics. And I think that's another Machiavellian vocabulary. It's the vocabulary of conciliation, of humanity, freedom, citizenly values, the values of the city, the polis, and it's more prominent in the work, in my reading, than the Machiavellianism we first thought of. So I will put that.